She stood at the drawing-room window with a cup of cold tea, forgotten in her hand, and she watched her husband cross the moonlit lawn toward the gatehouse where his mistress waited, and she watched him press the manor's entire ring of keys, the keys to every door, every cellar, every locked and private room in Ashworth Manor, into that woman's open palm. And if you had asked the Duchess of Ashworth in that moment what she intended to do about it, she could not have told you, because she did not yet know herself, not until the answer arrived in her hands with the cold, clean certainty of a woman who has finally stopped waiting to be told. By morning, every lock in that house would answer to a different key, and the Duke of Ashworth would learn, in the space of a single dawn, precisely what he had thrown away. Before we tell you how she managed it, and what she found locked inside her own husband's private study once the old keys stopped working, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from, and if you think a woman is entitled to lock her husband out of his own house after a betrayal like that. Hit subscribe and let us know. Because what the Duchess did next was only the beginning of what this family deserved. Margaret Ashworth had not always been a duchess who watched her husband's infidelities from behind glass, like a woman observing weather she could not control. She had been once plain Margaret Fenwick, the daughter of a country parson with more books than income, raised on Latin declensions and scripture, and a father's quiet insistence that a woman's mind was worth cultivating. She had married Charles Ashworth for reasons that had felt at 23 like love, though she understood now at 28 that what she had mistaken for love had been something closer to relief that a man of consequence had looked past her modest dowry and seen or claimed to see. The early years of the marriage had not been unhappy, precisely. Charles had been attentive, in the distracted way of men who marry believing attention is a debt paid once and then discharged, and Margaret had filled the silences he left behind with the management of a household too large for any one person's ordinary competence. Learning the estate's accounts and its tenants and its endless small emergencies with a thoroughness that the Duke, when he noticed at all, treated as a wife's natural and unremarkable duty rather than the considerable achievement it, in fact, was. It was only in the 3rd year of the marriage, when a fever took their infant son before he had lived to see his first spring, that something in Charles had gone quiet and then cold, and Margaret had watched her husband retreat from her exactly when she most needed him to remain. That grief simply wore different faces in different people, and that his face had chosen distance rather than tears. It was in the 4th year that Lucinda Hart arrived, a widow of uncertain origin and considerable charm, installed in a cottage on the estate's northern edge under the thin pretext of a distant connection to the Ashworth family, and it had taken Margaret rather longer than it ought to have to understand what her husband's frequent visits to that cottage actually signified, because she had not wanted to understand it, because understanding it would require her to act on knowledge she was not yet prepared to carry. The servants knew before she did. Servants always know before the lady of the house is permitted to know, for servants observe the comings and goings of carriages and candles with an attention their employers rarely credit them for possessing, and it was old Hodgins, the estate's steward, who had served Margaret's own father before her and had followed her to Ashworth out of a loyalty that predated her marriage entirely, who first allowed his careful discretion to slip, just once, in a manner that told her everything without requiring him to say a single incriminating word. She had asked him one autumn evening whether the Duke intended to dine at home, and Hodgins had paused a fraction too long before answering that his Grace had sent word he would dine at the northern cottage, and something in the particular flatness of his voice, the studied absence of any inflection at all, had told Margaret that this was not the first such evening, and that Hodgins had simply grown weary of pretending otherwise on his master's behalf. She did not confront Charles that night, nor the next, nor for many nights after, because confrontation required a kind of courage she had not yet located within herself, a courage that comes more easily to women who have not spent 5 years training themselves to make no demands, to occupy no more space than absolutely necessary, to treat their own unhappiness as an indulgence unworthy of a duchess's dignity. She instead watched with the same quiet, methodical attention she brought to the estate's ledgers as her husband's absences grew longer and less concealed, as his gifts to Lucinda Hart grew bolder, a length of silk here, a matched pair of carriage horses there. Purchases that any competent housekeeper of accounts would have flagged as extraordinary had the Duke not taken to settling them through channels his wife was not meant to examine. But Margaret examined them anyway, quietly, in the hours after the house had gone to sleep, because the parson's daughter in her had never quite stopped believing that the truth, however unwelcome, was always preferable to a comfortable ignorance, and because some stubborn ember of her father's teaching insisted that a woman who understood her own situation, however painful that understanding proved, was never truly powerless within it. The winter that followed brought a hardness to the manor that the servants felt as keenly as the frost on the window panes. Charles grew careless in a manner that suggested he had stopped troubling to consider his wife's feelings worth the effort of concealment, dining at the northern cottage 3 and 4 evenings a week, returning past midnight smelling of Lucinda's particular scent of orange blossom and brandy, offering Margaret explanations so thin and so rarely offered at all that the absence of explanation became, in itself, its own kind of statement. It was young Thomas, the stable boy of perhaps 11 years, orphaned the previous spring and taken in by the estate's charitable custom of finding places for the parish's parentless children, who first said aloud to Margaret what the whole household had learned to whisper only below stairs. He had grown fond of the Duchess over the winter, for she was the only person in that great house who asked after his reading and his sums with any genuine interest in the answer, and he found her one grey morning in the stable yard, watching with an unreadable stillness as the Duke's own favourite mare was saddled for another journey to the northern cottage. "Your Grace," Thomas said, with a terrible directness particular to children who have not yet learned that some truths are meant to be swallowed rather than spoken, "why does His Grace not love you the way you love him?" Margaret had not answered immediately. She had knelt instead in the frozen mud of the stable yard, heedless of her skirts, and taken the boy's cold hands in her own, and said only, "I do not know, Thomas, but I intend to find out precisely what I am worth, whatever the answer proves to be," and something in the saying of it, aloud to a child who could not judge her for the admission, had settled a resolve in her that had been gathering, unacknowledged, for the better part of a year. It was that same week that Margaret began, quietly and without announcement to anyone but Hodgins, to understand her own situation with a clarity she had previously avoided. She requested, on some pretext of household inventory, a full accounting of the estate's finances from the family solicitor, a Mr. Pruitt, who had served the Ashworth family for 2 decades, and who regarded the Duchess's request with the mild surprise of a man unaccustomed to being asked direct questions by the women of the household. What she found, upon examining the accounts with the same rigour she had once applied to her father's modest parish ledgers, unsettled her considerably more than her husband's infidelity alone had done. The estate's finances, she discovered, had grown thin in ways that Charles's evident spending on Lucinda Hart did not fully explain mortgages taken against the northern farms that Margaret had never been informed of. A series of loans arranged through a banker named Silas Grenville, whose name she did not recognize, were structured with a predatory cleverness that suggested either extraordinary carelessness on her husband's part or something considerably more deliberate. Mr. Pruitt, pressed gently but firmly, admitted that the Duke had conducted a great deal of this business personally, through Grenville directly, bypassing the solicitor's usual oversight entirely, a fact that struck Margaret as significant even before she understood precisely why. She raised the matter with Charles directly, on an evening in early winter when he had for once dined at home, and his reaction told her more than any confession could have. He had grown defensive in a manner disproportionate to a mere accounting inquiry, insisting the estate's finances were his own concern and no fit subject for a wife's meddling, and when Margaret pressed further, asking plainly who this Silas Grenville was and why his terms seemed so favourable to himself, Charles had risen from the table with a violence of motion that knocked his chair backward onto the floor, and said, in a voice Margaret had never before heard him use toward her, "You will leave matters to me that you have neither the mind nor the standing to understand, Margaret, and you will not raise this subject again." It was, in its way, a smaller cruelty than the northern cottage, and yet it was this moment, rather than any of Lucinda Hart's silk gowns or matched carriage horses, that Margaret would later identify as the true turning point of her marriage, the moment she understood not merely that her husband had stopped loving her, but that he had stopped believing her capable of understanding her own life, and that this second failure was, in its quiet way, the more unforgivable of the two. She did not raise the subject again, not directly, not to Charles. But she did not abandon it either. She began instead a slow, careful campaign of her own, copying figures from the estate ledgers into a private notebook she kept locked in her own writing desk, cultivating a careful acquaintance with the wives and daughters of the estate's tenant farmers, who mentioned in the unguarded way of women speaking to a duchess who actually listened, small grievances about mortgages, called in early in terms suddenly altered, corresponding discreetly with a barrister in the county town, a Mr. Aldous Fenn, whom her own father had once known and trusted, to ask questions about the legality of certain lending practices without revealing precisely whose practices she meant. What emerged, slowly over the following months, was a portrait considerably darker than a mere unfaithful husband. Silas Grenville, it transpired, had been systematically extending loans to Charles against increasingly desperate collateral, loans whose true terms, all while quietly acquiring, through intermediaries, an increasing financial stake in the very manor and lands the Duke believed remained entirely his own. Lucinda Hart, Margaret would eventually learn, though this piece of the puzzle arrived rather later and from an unexpected source, was not simply Charles's mistress, but Grenville's own cousin, installed at the estate's edge at Grenville's quiet suggestion, her charms deployed with a deliberateness that Charles, blinded by vanity and grief and the particular stupidity men reserve for flattery skillfully administered, had never once thought to question. It was on a bitter evening in late January, with sleet driving hard against the manor's tall windows and the fires burning low in every grate the servants had not yet troubled to replenish, that Margaret witnessed a scene that would finally crystallize a full year of gathering doubt into unshakable certainty. She had gone down to the drawing-room past midnight unable to sleep, and had seen through the rain-streaked glass the unmistakable shape of her husband crossing the lawn toward the gatehouse, where Lucinda Hart stood waiting beneath the portico's shelter, her figure lit by a single lantern held aloft against the weather. Margaret had watched with the strange, suspended calm of a woman observing a scene she had long anticipated and could no longer pretend to misread. As Charles reached the gatehouse and, after a brief exchange she could not hear through the glass and the storm, drew from his coat the great iron ring that held every key to Ashworth Manor. The study keys, the keys to the family's private apartments, keys that had belonged to Ashworth duchesses for 4 generations before Margaret had ever worn them at her own waist, and pressed them into Lucinda Hart's waiting palm. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning even at that distance, through glass and rain, a man handing over the keys to his own house, his own life, his own family's four-generation inheritance, to a woman who was not his wife, in full view of windows he had perhaps forgotten could be watched from at all. Margaret stood very still at the glass for a long moment after the two figures had disappeared into the gatehouse together, and she found, to her own considerable surprise, that she did not weep, that some deeper reservoir of feeling had exhausted itself over the preceding year and left in its place something colder and considerably more useful. A decision. Arriving with the swift finality of a door closing, she did not wait for morning to begin. She summoned Hodgins from his bed within the hour, and the old steward, seeing something in his mistress's face that he had perhaps been waiting a year to see arrive, did not trouble her with questions before agreeing to do precisely as she asked. By 2 in the morning, a rider had been dispatched to the county town to rouse the locksmith. Margaret had quietly cultivated an acquaintance with some weeks before, ostensibly regarding a broken cellar lock. A man named Josiah Rutt, who arrived before dawn with his apprentice and a cart full of tools, and asked no questions beyond those necessary to understand which locks required changing and in what order of urgency. By the grey light of that January dawn, every door in Ashworth Manor that Margaret Ashworth controlled, the great front doors, the study, the cellars where the family plate and the estate's remaining liquid funds were kept, the private apartments, even the modest side door the servants used for their own comings and goings, keys that existed nowhere else in the world except upon the ring Margaret now wore at her own waist, and upon a second spare ring locked within a strong-box that only Mr. Aldous Fenn, the barrister, and Margaret herself knew the location of. The old keys, the ones now resting uselessly in Lucinda Hart's possession, would open nothing at all when the sun rose fully over Ashworth's frost-hardened lawns. Charles did not return from the gatehouse until well past dawn, and it was Hodgins who met him at the great front door, standing before it with the particular impassive dignity of a servant delivering news he privately relishes, but is far too well trained to show any relish for at all. "Your Grace," Hodgins said, "I regret to inform you that your key no longer answers this lock, nor any lock in this house, by the Duchess's express instruction, and that her Grace requests you present yourself at the front door as a caller rather than attempt further entry until such time as she is prepared to receive you." Charles's reaction, as Hodgins would later describe it to Margaret with rather more satisfaction than strict propriety, allowed a steward, passed through several stages in rapid succession. Disbelief that his own wife would dare such a thing. Fury that a servant should be the one to deliver such news, as the cold reality of a locked door in freezing weather asserted itself over his pride, something considerably closer to alarm. He demanded to see Margaret directly, and Hodgins, with the same impassive dignity, informed him that her Grace was not at present prepared to receive him, and suggested with the faintest and most carefully controlled trace of enjoyment that his Grace might find more comfortable lodging at the northern cottage, where he had evidently passed a satisfactory night already. Margaret watched this exchange from an upstairs window, and she found, in observing her husband stranded on his own front steps, in the bitter January morning, an emotion she had not expected to feel at all amid the anger and the grief and the cold clarity of the preceding hours. Something almost like pity, quickly suppressed. For a man who had built his entire understanding of his own power upon the assumption that the house and everything within it would simply remain his, regardless of how he treated the woman who had spent 5 years holding it together in his frequent absence. But pity, she reminded herself, watching him pound a fist uselessly against a door that no longer answered to him, was a luxury she could not yet afford to indulge. Not until she understood the full extent of what Silas Grenville had done to the estate, and not until she had secured beyond any possibility of her husband's interference the evidence that would be needed to address it properly. It was in the days that followed, with Charles reduced to conducting his affairs from rooms at the county town's principal inn and sending increasingly desperate letters demanding entry to his own house, that Margaret, working with Mr. Fenn and a discreet accountant he recommended, finally assembled the full and damning shape of what had been done to the Ashworth estate. Silas Grenville had emerged through weeks of careful investigation, had extended Charles a series of loans structured to appear generous on their surface, while concealing in clauses written in language deliberately obscure terms that would allow Grenville to call the debts in full at moments calculated to cause maximum distress. R.A.I. and his vanity and his distraction had signed without troubling to have properly examined by his own solicitor. Worse and more damning still, Grenville had used a portion of these same loan arrangements to quietly purchase, through a chain of intermediary companies designed to obscure his involvement, a substantial and growing stake in the Ashworth lands themselves. Positioning himself to acquire outright ownership of a significant portion of the estate the moment Charles defaulted on terms Grenville had all but guaranteed would prove impossible to meet. Lucinda Hart's presence at the estate's edge, and her calculated cultivation of Charles's attentions in his grief-weakened state, was revealed through the testimony of her own former lady's maid, a woman named Sarah Combe. Dismissed from Lucinda's service under circumstances bitter enough that she required no persuasion at all to speak plainly to Margaret's solicitor, to have been arranged at Grenville's explicit direction, a cousin's charm deployed as deliberately as any of the loan's carefully obscured clauses, precisely to keep Charles too distracted and too flattered to examine his own finances too closely. Armed with this evidence, the loan documents, the chain of intermediary purchases, Sarah Combe's sworn testimony regarding Lucinda's true relationship to Grenville, and the deliberateness of her assignment to Ashworth's northern cottage, and a damning set of letters between Grenville and Lucinda herself that Margaret's tenant contacts had helped trace, and that Mr. Fenn had obtained through entirely proper legal channels, Margaret understood that she held in her possession not merely grounds for a private reckoning with her husband, but the means to expose a fraud that threatened not only her own marriage, but the livelihoods of every tenant family, families who had no notion that the security of their own homes had been quietly wagered against Charles's vanity and Grenville's patient scheming. She resolved, with the same clarity that had sent her to the locksmith on that first bitter dawn, that whatever reckoning was to come would not happen quietly, behind closed doors, where Charles's pride and Grenville's cleverness. It would happen, she decided, before witnesses, before the very tenants whose futures had been gambled, before the county society that had watched Charles' public infidelity with knowing smiles, and had assumed, as such society generally did, that a duchess's proper response to her own humiliation. The occasion presented itself with a timing that felt, to Margaret, almost providential. The estate's annual tenants' assembly, held each February in the Great Hall at Ashworth Manor, a tradition predating Margaret's own marriage by generations, and at which, this particular year, Charles intended to make a public announcement regarding certain necessary economies the estate would require, economies that Margaret now understood to be the direct and inevitable consequence of Grenville's engineered debts, economies that would fall, as such economies always did, most heavily upon the tenant families least able to absorb them. Margaret allowed Charles to believe, in the tense negotiations that preceded his readmission to the manor under carefully limited terms, that she intended to permit this assembly to proceed as he had planned it. that her fury over Lucinda Hart and the changed locks had perhaps begun to cool into the manageable resentment he no doubt believed all wives eventually settled into. She allowed him this belief, precisely because she intended, on the day of the assembly itself, to demonstrate to the whole assembled company exactly how mistaken it was. The great hall on the morning of the assembly, filled with its customary crowd, tenant farmers in their best coats, their wives in shawls carefully preserved for occasions of formality, the estate's own household staff arranged along the walls, and a scattering of county gentry who attended each year more from habit and curiosity than any real interest in the tenants' concerns, among them to Margaret's private satisfaction. Silas Grenville himself, who had apparently judged it prudent to observe in person. Charles rose at the appointed hour to deliver his address regarding the coming year's economies, and he had gotten no further than his first sentence, some vague and evasive language about the estate's need for careful stewardship in difficult times, when Margaret rose from her own seat beside him and requested, with a composure that carried further across the hall than any raised voice could have managed, that she be permitted to address the assembled tenants directly on a matter of some urgency to every family present. Charles, caught entirely unprepared, could do nothing but yield the floor to his own wife before an audience of witnesses too numerous and too socially significant for him to refuse, without creating a scene considerably worse than whatever he feared she might say. Margaret spoke plainly, and at length, and with a precision born of months spent mastering ledgers and legal language she had never expected to need. She laid before the assembled hall the full architecture of Silas Grenville's scheme, the predatory loans, the deliberately obscured terms, the quiet accumulation of intermediary ownership stakes designed to strip the Ashworth estate from beneath its own duke's feet, the calculated deployment of Lucinda Hart to ensure Charles remained too distracted by flattery to examine the fine print of his own ruin. She produced at the appropriate moments the documents Mr. Sear Fenn had helped her assemble, holding aloft for the hall's inspection the loan papers with their damning clauses, reading aloud portions of Sarah Comby's sworn testimony regarding Lucinda's true purpose at the estate, and finally, with a stillness that seemed to draw the very air from the room, the letters between Grenville and his cousin that laid the whole scheme bare in Grenville's own handwriting. The hall's reaction unfolded in the particular slow-motion horror of a crowd realizing all at once that a familiar and trusted arrangement has concealed something rotten beneath its surface. Gasps rising in scattered pockets as tenant families realized their own mortgages had been part of the same predatory pattern. A low and rising murmur of anger directed for the first time in Margaret's memory not at the Duchess's private humiliation, but at the banker who had orchestrated it and the husband whose vanity had let it happen. Silas Grenville, cornered by the weight of his own letters, read aloud before witnesses too numerous to intimidate into silence, attempted first bluster, and then, as the hall's mood hardened decisively against him, a hasty retreat toward the doors, where he found his path blocked by tenant farmers who had, in the space of Margaret's speech, come to understand precisely what his cleverness had cost their own family's security. Charles stood through the whole of his wife's address in a silence that shifted, visible to the entire hall, from outrage to disbelief to something that might, in a more private setting, have been shame, though he was too proud even now to name it as such before witnesses. It was only when Margaret turned, at the speech's conclusion, to address him directly, rather than the assembled hall, that the true weight of the morning settled fully upon him. You handed the keys of this house to a woman who was never anything more to you than an instrument of your own ruin, Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent hall. You called it love, or perhaps you called it nothing at all, having never troubled to examine your own heart any more carefully than you examined the papers you signed. I have spent a year learning what I am capable of understanding, Charles, and what I find I am capable of understanding is considerably more than you ever credited me for, and considerably more than has apparently occurred to Mr. Carl. Grenville, who mistook a duchess's silence for a duchess's stupidity, and has this morning discovered his error before every tenant whose future he intended to gamble away. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The hall's silence did the work that volume might otherwise have been required to do, and in that silence Charles Ashworth understood, for the first time in a year of careless cruelty, precisely what he had lost, and precisely how thoroughly his own wife had outmatched him in the reckoning. The weeks that followed the assembly brought a swift and thorough unravelling of everything Silas Grenville had spent months constructing. The county magistrate, informed by Mr. Bling Fenn of the full extent of the fraudulent lending scheme, and presented with documentation too comprehensive to dismiss, opened a formal investigation that would, within the year, see Grenville stripped of his banking licence and facing criminal proceedings for fraud, his intermediary companies unwound, and their improperly acquired stakes in Ashworth land restored to the estate through legal proceedings. Fenn pursued with a diligence that suggested he had been waiting years for a client with both the evidence and the resolve to pursue such a case properly. Lucinda Hart, her true purpose exposed before the entire county, and her cousin's scheme in ruins, departed the northern cottage within the fortnight, her charm having proven no match for a duchess's patient accumulation of proof, and she was not seen again in that part of Yorkshire, her name becoming among the tenant families she had helped deceive a byword for the particular cruelty of a beautiful face concealing a mercenary heart. Charles Ashworth, stripped by the Assembly's public reckoning of both his mistress and his illusions about his own wife's capacities, found himself facing a choice considerably starker than any he had confronted in the comfortable years of his marriage's early complacency. He could continue to insist upon the pride that had governed his conduct for the better part of a year, and lose entirely the wife whose competence had just saved his estate from ruin, or he could undertake the considerably more difficult work of understanding what he had so nearly thrown away, and attempt, with whatever humility he could locate within himself, to earn back a trust he had done nothing to deserve. He chose, in the end, the harder path, though it took him the better part of that spring to walk it with any real sincerity. He came to Margaret first, not with grand declarations, but with small practical gestures that suggested he had finally begun to understand the nature of what he had lost. He asked her opinion on estate matters he would once have dismissed as beyond a wife's proper concern, and troubled, for the first time in their marriage, to actually listen to her answers. He sought out Mr. Fenn himself to understand the full legal proceedings against Grenville, rather than leaving the matter entirely to his wife's management. He visited the tenant families whose mortgages had been caught in Grenville's scheme, not with the distant condescension of a landlord dispensing charity, but with something closer to genuine contrition. Working alongside Mr. Fenn and Margaret both to restructure the estate's finances on terms that would actually protect the families who depended upon it. It was young Thomas, the stable boy, who first remarked to Margaret that the Duke had taken to asking after her whereabouts each morning with an anxiety that suggested a man genuinely afraid, for the first time, of losing something he had once assumed permanent, and Margaret, hearing this second-hand report with a caution she was not yet ready to abandon, said only that she would believe such changes when she had observed them proven over considerably more than a single spring. She made him wait, in the end, the better part of a year, watching to see whether his changed conduct represented genuine transformation or merely the temporary contrition of a man frightened by consequences rather than genuinely altered by reflection. She watched him decline invitations to the sort of society gatherings where Lucinda Hart's type of charm had once found him so vulnerable, watched him take up, with what appeared to be real application, the estate's daily management rather than leaving it entirely to his wife's competence as he once had. Watched him treat the tenant families with a respect that survived, even after the immediate crisis of Grenville's fraud had been resolved, and there was no longer any pressing need to perform contrition for an audience. It was Hodgins, watching this slow transformation with the same shrewd steward's eye that had once told Margaret everything she needed to know through a single carefully flat sentence, who observed to her privately that a man who continued good conduct once no one remained to witness or reward it, rather than merely learn to perform change convincingly. And Margaret found she trusted Hodgins' judgment on this matter rather more than she trusted her own still wary heart. It was nearly a full year after that bitter January dawn when Charles finally said to her, in the quiet of the estate's now thriving study, the words she had privately wondered whether she would ever hear him say with any real sincerity behind them. "I did not deserve the year you gave me to prove myself," he said, "and I do not deserve even now the trust I am asking you to consider extending me again. But I have spent this year learning what it costs a man to mistake his wife's silence for her limitation and to mistake his own vanity for love, and I find I would rather spend the whole of my remaining life earning back what I so carelessly threw away than spend one more day pretending the keys to this house or to my own heart were ever truly mine to give to anyone but you." Margaret listened to this with the same careful attention she had once brought to Grenville's obscured loan clauses, testing each word for the hollowness that had characterized so many of Charles's earlier explanations, and finding to her own quiet relief, none. "I kept the new keys myself, Charles," she said, "not merely to lock you out, but to learn, for the first time in 5 years of marriage, what it felt like to hold the security of my own life in my own 2 hands rather than trusting it entirely to yours. I find I am not now inclined to surrender that lesson, even to a man who has genuinely earned back my trust, but I am inclined perhaps to make you a second set." It was not, by any measure, the language of romantic poetry. It was the language of ledgers and locks and hard-won practical trust, and it was, for precisely that reason, the truest reconciliation either of them could have offered the other, forged as it had been in the cold clarity of a January dawn, rather than the easy warmth of words. The years that followed saw Ashworth Manor transformed into an estate managed jointly in a manner unusual enough for that corner of Yorkshire to draw occasional comment from county society, though the tenant families who had watched Margaret's public reckoning with Grenville had long since concluded that the Duchess's judgment merited rather more deference than idle gossip ever paid it. Margaret's private notebook, once kept locked and secret in her writing desk, became in time an open ledger the whole estate consulted, and young Thomas, grown by then into a promising young man, Margaret had personally seen, educated at her own expense, took up a position managing the estate's accounts under her direct supervision. The boy who had once asked her in a frozen stable yard why her husband did not love her, now numbering among the small circle who understood exactly how thoroughly that question had been answered. Charles never again attempted to conduct the estate's business without his wife's full knowledge and partnership, and it became, in the Manor's own quiet way, a kind of standing joke between them, never spoken before company, hard-won humour of 2 people who had rebuilt something worth having from the wreckage of what carelessness had nearly destroyed, that the keys to Ashworth Manor had only ever truly belonged to whoever proved themselves capable of guarding what they unlocked. Having proven herself considerably more capable than anyone had once credited her for, would hold the master set for as long as she cared to keep it. On the 10th anniversary of that bitter January dawn, Charles had a new ring of keys forged for her as a gift, wrought in silver rather than the estate's old iron. Each key marked with a small engraved symbol of the door it opened, 20 and letters small enough to require close examination, but permanent enough to outlast them both a single line, to the woman who taught this house and this duke what true security actually required. Margaret wore that ring at her waist for the whole of her life afterward, and tenant families still told their children, for a generation and more after the story of the Duchess who had changed every lock in the house by dawn, and had in doing so finally locked out everything unworthy of remaining within it, and let in a marriage built upon something considerably sturdier than the vanity and silence that had nearly destroyed it.